So hi everyone, I'm showing that we're live on Facebook. I'll give us about a minute or two for people to find us. And as I usually do for these live casts, I will bounce this over to my personal page in case folks might be used to accessing us there. So if you would just stand by, I'm here with Lisa Hayes, who is our guest for today's live cast, and we'll be getting started in about a minute or so. So welcome to the Institute for Creative Mindfulness. So welcome to the Institute for Creative Mindfulness. I'm Dr. Jamie Marich. If you're looking for today's live cast, you are in the right place. We're scheduled for a noon Eastern start. And this is one of our interviews in the Black Lives Matter series that we have been hosting here over the last several weeks. And I'm honored and delighted to be joined today by Lisa Hayes, who is a team member with the Institute for Creative Mindfulness. She's one of our EMDR-approved consultants and facilitators. And I got to know Lisa prominently through her good friend, Susie Rudy, who is one of our faculty members, senior faculty members with ICM. And as soon as I invited Susie onto the faculty, she said, I have to bring my friends Lisa and Tammy with me. And that's how I got to know Lisa. And I'm so glad that Susie made that connection, because I've gotten to know Lisa in her own right as just a tremendous presence and a tremendous person, really making a difference here. And the content of our live cast today, I'm really excited to be talking about, which is inclusive anti-racism, creating space for LGBTQIA plus persons of color, space and voice and advocacy. And I'm glad we scheduled the live cast today, because it is technically the last day of Pride Month, yet it is my earnest hope that Pride Month doesn't just become a month, and that when we go into July and in the days that follow, we continue to do our part as professionals and as advocates for elevating the voices of everybody who's been traditionally marginalized, especially in the LGBT community. So Lisa, welcome. Thank you for being here with us.
Hi, thanks for having me. I think what I'm doing in my kind of evolution as a always Zoom person is just like noticing the different ways that microphone affects my hair shape. So that's a little of what I was doing there. Yeah, where I was like, okay, all right, we're not getting as much volume. Anyway.
I relate.
Yeah,
I relate.
Good.
So Lisa, you're welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself personally and professionally.
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably first it's a good idea just to kind of like speak to language.
Sure.
I think language has weight and holds value. And so in this space, I think it's important for me to say these are the ways that I refer to myself. And it's certainly not intended to diminish or shift the way that another person would speak about themselves. But from a racial identity standpoint, I refer to myself as Black, brown, person of color, pretty much, without much rhyme or reason. It's just whatever comes up for me. So you'll probably hear me use those words to reference myself from a racial identity standpoint. And then I refer to myself as queer. And I know that word holds weight for folks and has historically been weaponized, right, in our community, and has become maybe dangerous or not as nice for people. And so I just want to hold that space. I know it. It's a word that I've chosen and that I reclaim and that I think really encompasses my identity. So at any rate, throughout this space, I'll probably refer to myself as a Black queer person or a queer person of color. I also identify as a cisgendered woman. And so I'm using she, her pronouns. So I'll often say as a queer woman of color, that kind of stuff. So anyway, that's kind of my intro spiel about language. But that being said, yeah, of course. I do identify as a Black queer woman. And I think that when I think about introducing myself, and I've thought about it a lot because some of what I think is really important about this space, but also operates as being a little dangerous, right, is this idea around vulnerability and exposure. And there's kind of a fatigue right now that I'm walking with, and so there's kind of like this emotional or vulnerability fatigue, but it's my plan to be as vulnerable as possible in the interest of having a good old conversation. So I was thinking about the points of identity that are important to me. So I grew up in a military family. So both of my parents were in the service. That's the way that they met. And then my father continued to be in the military throughout. and my parents split up and we moved to Ohio, which is relevant around identity development because it created a space for me to have had one experience of the world, which was a little bit more intentional in its seeking of different kinds of people. And then I moved to a space here in Ohio where there just wasn't as much visible diversity. There wasn't as much deviation from a certain look or viewpoint. And we moved in with my grandmother, who was a delightful woman, but also had grown up in a decent amount of isolation, kind of culturally herself. And so probably in my house, when I think about it, Bell Hooks wrote a beautiful book called Bone Black, where she talks about her personal development in life. And she says this really beautiful thing in the beginning, where she says she was kind of struggling to create self and identity in a way that was distinct from the things around her, but also inclusive of the things around her. And so I think that really resonates for me around just intersections of identity, right? So I'm identifying as a Black person, also as a person who holds Appalachian values, right, from my mother's family and how we were raised, as a person who is queer, as a person who was raised in a religious space that was really conservative. I was going to say fairly conservative, then I was like, Catholicism is very conservative, right?
Right.
So,
Yes.
but and so I think all of those elements, and I had this wonderful kind of sisterhood with my siblings, and then a bit of a difficult relationship with my mother, frankly, just around her own limitations and some of her unmet and untreated mental illness. And so when I think about identity and ownership of identity and voice, I often think that the way that I was trained to use my voice is not the way that I prefer to use my voice now. I think I was very much trained to use my voice in a way that contributed to the collective, right? And protected. Most of my childhood was very fear-based, right? What we didn't have, what we couldn't get. And I think shaking that off a bit and thinking, that I'm entitled to a full expression of myself. And that expression should serve no one but me.
Right.
And that's a space that I can exist in has been kind of like a radical revolution, for me in my life, where it's become, more visible. So I think that's when I think about expression and voice and identity, I think that there's this juxtaposition from the way that I was raised, which was real conformity based, right? Be this thing, don't be disruptive. What you do should contribute to the family survival. To this adult expression of like, actually, like I should probably think about my own survival and my own, kind of emotional need. And so I think that's kind of where I operate often. And I think when there's more fear and there's more danger, I can regress into this space where my identity is less robust. And I think that's some of what this feels like right now for me, is trying to insist that I am all things, right? That I am Black and I am queer, and that those spaces hold value and maybe not equal value all the time, just in my expression or whatever, but that they both hold value and they can both exist without fear. And so I think that's kind of how I got here.
So this is a question I like to ask people who grew up conservative of any kind, or like myself, or people who grew up the voice squelched in some way. What led to the shift for you? Was it one specific turning point, or was it a series of influences that led to that shift in how you use your voice?
That's like a really beautiful question, firstly. I mean, that's just what a great thing to think about. It is. It's such a beautiful question. I think, so I love reading, so I'll often kind of throw names in here of people that mean something to me. So James Baldwin means something to me. He's also a Black queer author, poet, activist. And he has this lovely quote that says that he thought he was alone in his pain until he read a book. And then he realized that his pain is connected to the pain of people over centuries of time. And I think for me, that was a safe place to put my curiosity. And it was a place that was allowed, right? That I could have this imaginative reality and this imagined life, where I could see myself as having different capacity and different identity and different experiences. And so I think reading, really helped to shift that. And then I think also maybe like a little just tragedy and sadness. And, both of my parents have passed away. They both died very young. And throughout that process, right, when there were just these additional burdens of caretaking and giving, there was also this release of needing approval from that space or being monitored in that way. And I think in a way that is meant to diminish the sadness of the tragedy of it, I think my siblings and I all feel like we've been given this space to kind of open our chest a bit and to live just more authentically,
Mhm.
having navigated that tragedy together and then feeling kind of less oppressed
Right.
by this traditional pathway in life where you're making other people proud and all that kind of stuff.
Right. And yeah. And what role did becoming a therapist, a clinical social worker play in your evolution?
Yeah, I don't, I think maybe, I mean, I'm a believer that we are who we are all the time. And I
Mhm.
think that there were elements of that that were always true in my role, in my life, and in my family, and in other work that I had done. And
Mhm.
so when I originally went to school, I was actually pre-med. But I think that's just those like real broad tracking systems, in high school. Like, I care about people. They're like, great, be a doctor,
Mhm. Yeah.
even though my hard science skills are limited. So,
Relate.
yeah.
I didn't know that about you, and that's another thing we have in common. The whole pre-med, that was my
Ye
technically my first major.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I figured out that that was not my path pretty quickly. Um,
Yeah.
but I went into, I was always curious of people. And I think one of the benefits of
Mhm.
having a childhood that has, kind of trauma and distress embedded is that it makes an excellent observer of people,
Yes.
out of
Yes.
those children. And so that was always something. Yeah, right.
Mhm.
That's a way to spin that, to reframe that.
Yeah. Mhm.
But so I was always interested in why, from a kind of behavior standpoint, like what about
Mhm.
a series of a person's life would lead to this space, to this behavior,
Mhm.
to this expression. And so that's where I started. I started very much in a social theory place, and so I have some degrees in sociology and gender studies, and I was
Mhm.
interested in the why and how it got there,
Mhm.
and thinking about it theoretically. And then it just felt like when I moved to graduate education, I wanted to apply that theory somewhere. I wanted it
Mhm.
to hold value and to be tangible, and to be more accessible from an
Yeah.
experiential standpoint. And so I think it was really just I'm profoundly interested in people and trying to figure out, like how are we
Mhm.
together, and how can we have more, like, of an intentional awareness of each other and of our
Sure.
impact and of our joy. So.
So to that point about awareness and impact, the title of our talk today is
Hmm.
inclusive anti-racism.
Hmm.
So when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community, where have things been exclusive as you have seen it in anti-racism work or in even how the Black community might embrace LGBT plus folks?
Oh, everywhere. I mean, I think there's this
Mhm.
space where it can be exclusionary, and I almost think without malice, but I think that
Mhm.
whenever the threat and the danger and the fear is very high in a community, it almost feels like we only have the energy to do one thing. And I think quite
Ah.
often, in a Black or brown space, it feels almost like, isn't it hard enough for us? Isn't it hard enough? And so it feels like we're all circling, this one wound, and
Mhm.
trying to put our energy there and to say, hey, how can we heal this space? How can we give it what it deserves? And often other points of identity, right? Other intersections of identity have been, in my experience, right? I certainly can't speak for every Black group or experience, but in my experience, have almost been received as a distraction from this very important
Mm.
wound,
Mhm.
around race and existence and basic survival, right? Because there's so much
Mhm.
danger embedded in Blackness,
Mhm.
for me and for the Black and brown folks that I know. And so in that way, I think there's been some kind of like casual kind of dismissing of other things, right? Almost like, hey, we have to
Mm.
survive first before we can exist in any other
Yeah.
way.
Mhm.
Um, and then I think, within the queer community, I think there's almost this assumption that racism, classism, transphobia, that this kind of stuff doesn't exist because it's a community of marginalized people. And so I've often found in
Mm.
those spaces that it is a lack of discussion, right? That
Yeah.
there's an assumption that this is a safe place,
Mhm.
because the all of us collectively know what it is, right, to be treated
Right.
poorly, and that we've sought out these special spaces, um, in order not to do that. But, we know that's not true. And I think as a person who identifies as a Black queer woman, quite often I've seen the appropriation of Black culture, right, running rampant in queer spaces, and folks
Mhm.
who are engaging in, almost like a performative identity that is
Yeah.
really saturated
Mhm.
with Black culture, and particularly with
Mhm.
Black women.
Mhm.
And so that's always been something that it's like to call that space out and to say, hey, actually, that phrase or that pattern of speech, it's
Mhm.
microaggressive in the beginning because it doesn't
Mm.
speak to the speech
Mhm.
patterns of Black women wholly, as a
Mhm.
whole space. Not only
Yeah.
that, but let's recognize how much of Black culture we're borrowing here and we're
Mhm.
incorporating.
Mhm.
And I think folks in my experiences have a hard time hearing that because they feel
Yeah.
as if they're very aware of oppression, and they
Mhm.
feel like their life is anti-oppression, right? And they're doing
Yeah.
that work. And I think making sure that anti-racism is a
Right.
part of that story has been, in my experience, a bit harder to call out and to say, hey, listen, there is work
Mhm.
to be done inside of this house also.
Yeah.
Um,
Can you give us an example? Because I'm very, every year I do this work, I'm more attuned to and want to do better with cultural appropriation and being aware of when I've done it, being aware of how people around me may do it. And I think you bring up an excellent point on that I've never
yeah.
considered. And a lot of people listening might not even know what cultural appropriation means.
Okay.
So I don't know if you're willing to do a little breaking down of that and how you might see it in queer communities, especially. Any specific examples?
Yeah, I mean, a ton really. I mean, I think cultural appropriation at its most kind of like low-hanging fruit definition is, are we engaging in expressions or performances that are not unique or kind of to our own origin and to our own
Hmm.
experiences, right? Are we borrowing from the experience of other people
Hmm.
to express ourselves in ways that we think are socially relevant? So, what do I mean
Mm,
by that? Is kind of like,
yeah.
what's the language pattern? So, for instance, I'll do a couple like easy ones when people are like, "Oh,
Yeah.
hey, girl," or
Hmm.
"mm," or I mean, these kind of spaces that have really been popularized in this way that is performatively Black, which again
Yeah.
is already it's already not great, right? That those are the
Hmm.
ways in which
Yeah.
the world assumes that Black women communicate, and we can see that demonstrated in our media, right? We can see, right, there's always the sassy Black, or the kind of like big
Hmm.
head shaking, like
Hmm.
no,
Hmm.
right? No, no, she didn't. This kind of space, and
Yeah.
so it already feels reductive, right? Even when you're
Hmm.
thinking about Black culture and Black patterns of communication,
Hmm.
which often have a rich history there, right? About the ways in which Black folks have communicated in relative code around
Hmm.
safety and acknowledgement of each
Hmm.
other. Um, kind of like the DAP, the history of the DAP, right, was
Hmm.
developed with Black soldiers, right,
Yeah.
to have a sense of camaraderie that wouldn't immediately be punished in a
Hmm.
military culture. And so just those sorts of things, right, if you are borrowing from spaces that don't belong to you, right, and so we're kind of like harvesting Black
Yeah.
culture or harvesting Black art. And I think often people think about that as being, I don't know. I mean, I've heard folks express it in ways that it feels like they're joining, or it's this extension, or we're
Hmm.
kind of all in this together. But I think even in Columbus, there are organizations that will say even queer spaces in Columbus that are borrowing all of this Black art, that are borrowing all
Hmm.
of this Black culture, don't hold special
Hmm.
space for Black folks. They don't
Hmm.
hold that. They don't create a space for it. They don't have any intentional,
Yeah.
kind of stuff. And so I think it's about being mindful. Is the thing that I'm saying or doing or wearing or
Hmm.
participating in, is it
Hmm.
mine, or have I borrowed it from somewhere else? And can I be critical of where I borrowed it from? And did I
Hmm.
borrow it from a place that was already
Yeah.
exploiting and engaging in kind of racist caricatures
Right.
of yeah.
And this is a fascinating discussion in and of itself, because I mean, a lot of the line I've had to look at is what's the difference between appropriating culture and showing appreciation with
Yeah.
credit.
Uh-huh.
Using things to perhaps build bridges to look
Right.
at points. But I think you bring up a couple that a lot of borrowing is stealing, especially when you don't give it credit,
Yeah.
appropriate credit, or when you're not using your space to elevate the voices of the
Yeah.
people you're borrowing
Absolutely.
from.
Yeah. Or protect them, which has happened,
Yeah.
in our community. There's been some particular fragmentation of a queer community around an event that happened a few years ago at one of our
Hmm.
prides that involved young Black, queer, and trans folks who were
Hmm.
trying to create a space to make a statement during a Pride celebration
Yeah.
about Black Lives Matter. And there was a lot of fragmentation where it felt like, hey, we're all down to use Black art, right? Black
Hmm.
music, Black
Hmm.
influences, but we're not really as prepared to tolerate Black pain. Or Black
Hmm.
need and Black oppression, and I think that's one of the tricky things, is that Pride has become this space where we've decided to celebrate, right? And we've kind of lost, I think, in my opinion, some of the pain and the struggle and the protest, right? That the riot that that was
That started
Pride.
Pride. Yes.
Yeah, and so now we've made it easier to consume, and it's become a bit corporate, and people feel more comfortable in it because it's not as painful, it's not as difficult, and people feel like they can easily align with it.
Hmm.
Um, And then when you bring in this space for Black and brown folks, where they're like, hey, listen, there is still pain and oppression and fear here. I think it's harder. I think folks, it's not as nice, and people don't want it mixed. They don't want it to disrupt the party. And I think
Right.
that's a lot of the struggle about having some inclusivity there. And can we invite those voices
Hmm.
of Black and brown folks to these spaces and be accountable for that?
Yeah. Yeah. So as we're talking about exclusivity here as the opposite of inclusivity, I'm hearing really
Yeah.
two potential issues. There's the LGBTQ plus communities
Uh-huh.
issues that may
Yeah.
need to be addressed, but
Yeah.
then also within spaces that may be, I mean, just for lack of a more pointed term, Black culture, brown culture.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, just speaking clinically, I'll speak to what I know. Over the years, I have worked with many folks of color, people of color, who have had just incredibly, horribly traumatic experiences being shunned out from their families
Mm-hmm.
because of what the cultural expectation can be. And I've heard criticism from some other folks I've worked with about the role that the Black church can play in some
Mm-hmm.
communities in
Mm-hmm.
really being resistant towards LGBTQ folks. And again, anything you've observed there and what you would like to see done about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing I would say, just kind of like in a reaction to kind of what I heard you say, is that I think
Yeah,
that all traditional religious spaces create space that's difficult for queer folks, in my opinion.
agreed.
And a
Yeah.
lot of families, right,
Hmm.
and so I think some of the ways in which we focus on these subgroups, right, of folks is
Yeah.
again this idea that there's already so much pain
Hmm.
involved in surviving the world as a Black person, as a person of
Right.
color,
That
that
I hear.
some of the sensations of exclusion within that community are particularly dangerous, all of which I think is the
Mm.
result of white supremacist realities and oppression, right? This idea
Yeah.
that for a marginalized person to be kicked out of their group is so
Mm.
much more dangerous than for a
Yeah.
person who the world generally creates space for and helps to
Yeah.
cater to. And so there is a lot of community and support and security in the Black church, right? This
Right.
idea that there's a whole family there. And so I think being excluded from that has this deeper impact
Yeah.
because there are fewer
Yeah.
places that will embrace you in that same way or in that same
Hmm.
vulnerability that feel comfortable and safe.
Right.
Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I think that it is radical to be who you are. And I think that in most spaces, there's a radical sense of deviance when you say, hey, I'm all of me. And anytime we're talking about a society that centers the experiences of white, straight, cis Christian people, any deviation from that creates a space of isolation. And
Mm.
so, for these Black and brown folks, right, the kind of Black queer family, there is that. And then also there's that sensation of deviation from
Right.
maybe your own personal family or Black culture or Black religious practice. And so I think
Hmm.
it's about the severity and about where do we go, right? So if
Hmm.
my Black community no longer engages with me or sees me, is it safe for me to go anywhere else?
No.
And so yeah, I think that certainly plays a part in it. And also I think there is a history of folks just being exclusionary to queer folks in general, right? That
Yeah.
because this morality comes in, this instrument of
Hmm.
morality that is weaponized against queer folks. And so we can all argue the morality of racism and ending racism. And
Right.
folks can I mean, it doesn't challenge folks very much. I mean, I think
Hmm.
it challenges like oppressors and, like
Yeah.
aggressively racist people. But for the most part, everyone can put a sign in their yard, right? And they see that as kind of a universally like, duh, right? This kind of like abolitionist
Yeah.
mindset where
Hmm.
any faith-based practice would support, that
Hmm.
racism is a no-no. And I think that it becomes more dangerous for folks to then also extend that kind of capacity, that sense of like seeing and holding humanity and value to
Right.
queer folks because the affiliation often creates a space for exclusion because we live in a country, of course, where there's no protection for that, really.
Right.
you know, so
Right.
yeah.
And then something I've been real fascinated in exploring in a lot of my own writing is, do we do these things to make us feel better about ourselves? And are we
Oh
all
no,
guilty of it?
Jamie, don't get me on the
You know? Well,
yeah.
for example, in the new version of Trauma and the 12 Steps, which is coming out next month, I quote Nadia Bolz-Weber, who's one of my favorite progressive ministers, and she's also in recovery, and she goes, "I think in our culture, our drug of choice is thinking we're better than other people.
Mm-hmm.
So whether like as a recovering alcoholic, I'm lording that over people who still drink and use, whether as, a
Yeah.
white person, I feel better than folks of color. As a straight person, I feel more moral than, growing
Yeah.
up in a pretty conservative environment. I mean, whenever I would start to come out with my liberal challenges, when I would see that things weren't working
Yeah.
the way that Christians should work, I would often be met with, well, at least we don't kill babies.
Yeah.
And it was like from
Yeah.
this clear place of like, well, this puts me on the moral high ground.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I
Absolutely.
mean, as soon as I said that, I saw you raise the soapbox. So I'm curious, your
Uh,
soapbox, like why do we do these? What is it about this need to feel better than other people that may
I
drive
mean,
some of this?
frankly, thank you for inviting my soapbox. Often I'm being asked to leave at places,
Oh, I
where
love
it's like, don't bring that in
soapboxes.
here. Well, but I think there's this idea that discomfort, right, is necessary to create change, because if you create a space of discomfort, then the focus can be on relieving my discomfort, and it doesn't get so focused on a history of violence and oppression and racism. So one, I think there's an element there where people are like, okay, well, I'm uncomfortable with this, or this causes me pain, right? And so we allow it to kind of be recentered in our own experience, and we say, okay, so then what can I do, right, to shift this pain and this discomfort, which is quite often why folks will say, hey, this is why protest is impactful, because
Mhm,
racism is not new, right?
mhm,
Either are protest, frankly, but now people are like, oh, there's a thing and we have to go do the thing. It kind of like reminds people that there's this thing, which is an expression of privilege, right? The
mhm.
ability for it not to matter if it doesn't matter to you all
Right.
the time. And so I
Mhm,
think there's that, kind of there in that space. Are we just doing it to feel better? Are we just doing it? And in some ways, I would say, yes, that's been my experience, because I think
mhm,
about, there's some language that I like that I've incorporated in some trainings about like pain tourism, this idea,
mm,
that when it's when it's kind of created into a place to visit, right,
mhm.
which means when it starts to impact your daily life, because it's impacting the
Right.
lives of Black queer people every day, and I don't see these signs. I've just now all these Black Lives Matter signs, or all these, but every day I've been Black and I've been
Yeah.
experiencing these things.
Yeah.
And so this idea about like when we create an event for people to visit, right? And people come in and they see the pain and they react and they respond to it and they have behaviors that I think are appropriate and trying to create some repair, that's fantastic. But I think the request of all people, but certainly of folks who are in oppressed groups, is that, what happens when you've passed through the tour and you're on to your next thing, right? Do we see it as the space where you observe, digest, repair it enough for you to feel okay about it, or for you to feel like you've contributed, for you to feel like you've done something, that you've become better than that, or that you've made a statement, and then we move on to the next thing? And I think that
Mhm,
marginalized folks have plenty of evidence historically for that as being true,
mhm,
right? We think about all these situations that are horrible violations of just a person's ability to exist, that had the tour, right? Everyone kind of drove through and oohed and awed, and they sent water to Flynn
mhm.
and they collected money, for these
Yeah.
things. But now the tour's over. Now the tour's over, and
Mhm,
that population of predominantly Black folks is still struggling
mhm,
to secure clean water for themselves. And so I think
mhm.
sometimes for me as a Black queer person, I worry about that
Yeah.
that that thing that happens in our culture, where the
Mhm,
history becomes very short and our attention span is very short, and people kind of drive through and then
mhm,
they leave it. And I think, again, that's an expression and an exercise in privilege, but it also contributes to erasure. This idea that if
mhm.
it, it's only important, it only exists, it's only real if
Yeah.
white folks are observing it. And I don't mean that to sound so harsh, but
Mhm.
it's like that's the
It's
truth
true.
around
Yeah.
media. That's the truth
Yeah.
around, it's just the truth. It's the truth around how we own information and how information gets distributed. And so I think this idea that it becomes this process of feeling better, right, or
Yeah.
feeling better than other folks,
Mhm,
um, I think is the case. And I think often, as a person who does come from a poor Appalachian, kind of white background as well, I think often people really paint their innocence on poor white folk. Like
mhm,
there's this kind of middle and upper class whiteness that's like, well,
mhm.
we're not, we're not doing that. Of
Right.
course we're not. We're not,
Right.
no one here is like burning crosses, right? That it becomes this kind of
Right.
like low level,
Mhm.
kind of like country rural, like all these people. But quite frankly, I'm more interested in major organizations and businesses that don't have
Oh yeah.
space to offer protection. I'm more interested in the people who write these laws or who continue to perform
Mhm.
these like these practices of oppression. I'm less worried in some ways
Yeah.
about these individual acts of racism. And so I think
Yeah.
that
It's a
too
good
creates a
point.
space where I'm like, hey,
Hmm.
listen, I hear you, but this has to be in full-time work,
Yeah.
to change and shift this from a place that was never intended to serve
Hmm.
marginalized people. And I think that's my soapbox in 12
We'll
parts.
stay we'll stay on it, because I have another
Okay.
question that I've really been giving a chance for all of our speakers here to soapbox about, which is,
Yeah.
do you think what's happening now is different or could be different because of what we've all just been through with COVID, and perhaps paying more attention, or are we paying more attention, or are you seeing it as just more of the same?
Um, well, again, I'll echo some James Baldwin or other, kind of like
Yeah.
historical civil rights activists, is that hope is one of my only things. So
Hmm.
I hope desperately that this world becomes safer for the people that I love and for the children that I love, right?
Yeah.
And for the children that I don't even know, that I just want to have an easier journey in this
Hmm.
space. So I'm hopeful always in the capacity of people to do better and to be better and to hear feedback and to shift in response to that feedback. Now, do I have much evidence of that?
Hmm.
Not really. I don't really have much evidence, and I'm not seeing much evidence right now, right? Where I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of symbolic, and that Malcolm X said that they're going to try and get you with symbolic right, photo ops, but they're not going to change anything
Hmm.
systemically. And so that's that argument, right, around diversity versus equity, right? That diversity
Hmm.
is just painting the same old house a different color, right? So that so I shut up, and so I calm down about it. And look, there's a picture, and there's some ambiguously raced people in there. We've covered the spectrum. There's some
Right.
people who we're taking visual cues from are different or
Yeah.
deviant from this centered whiteness, which is painting the exact same house a different color, as opposed
Yeah.
to equity, right? And kind of equitable access, in which case we have to tear down this house. It was never built to have enough entrances for all of us, right? And so I worry that what we're getting now is a diversity. We're getting companies coming out with statements, right? And I'll be
Yeah.
honest, this is another baby soapbox, is that they're coming
Please.
out with statements that took them a week to come up with. They had to form a
Yeah.
committee for it, which is how I know
Yeah.
that it's not embedded in your
Right.
values or in your statement.
Right.
You had to have a separate committee to think critically about racism and access, which is bananas to me, because it's 2020. Like, I think we've had
Yeah.
plenty of time to think, And so I think, these are these ways in which I'll say, listen, I'm really pleased that every place that I go has a statement about it now, but I'm
Hmm.
not sure whether or not those institutions, those places, those businesses, those people have significantly or substantively shifted the truth, right? Are you hiring different people? Are you creating space to pay people for their work in that, in that way, and to invite them and to include them? Are you shifting the curriculum? Are you checking your language? Are you reimagining, right, your
Hmm.
social media presence? I mean, this kind of stuff. So
Hmm.
I would like to think that people can shift and be different. I don't know. I don't so far, not a ton of evidence, not a ton of
Yeah.
like relief there. My body, as we're doing this, right, simultaneous to this are all of these killings and lynchings and people trying to attack the rights of trans folks and people trying to
Yeah.
attack the rights of women and other queer folks in the queer family, and so
Yeah.
it's like, I think so, but at the same time, this country and in some ways this world is demonstrating that the opposite might also be true.
Yeah. And there's just so much you said in there that was rich. Yeah. On Juneteenth, there was a company that I saw put out a statement that made me want to vomit, just knowing everything that company stands for.
Correct. Correct. But that's that, they call that
Yeah.
that rainbow capitalism, that pink capitalism, right?
Hmm.
Where we're willing to exploit the identities of
Yeah.
marginalized folks to increase our profit. And so even
Right.
though, you're going to put a little flag there, or you're going to make a
Yeah.
statement about equality, which by the way should not be a radical statement. We should not have to come up
Thank
with it.
you.
Do you
Hmm.
know, like, we should not, why
Hmm.
do you have a committee to say that this is wrong and people are
Hmm.
deserving of
Yeah.
living, right?
Right.
um so you put your flag up there, you put your little statement up there in the hopes that you can, kind of, in this kind of capitalist wheel, so you can get more money and you can exploit this space, which is not the same as representing
Right.
people. It's not the same, right, as asking yourself, how many black folks, how many black queer folks did you have on the committee that was writing the statement? I
Right.
got to tell you, I've mostly worked in predominantly white spaces, so I can't
Right.
imagine that you had
Right.
a, you know what I mean? I can't imagine outside of
Yeah.
like Black owned, like really defined spaces of like,
Hmm.
this is a Black business. I can't imagine that you had a ton of diversity there.
And
Yeah.
something that I took on in Trauma 12 is this need in the addiction community, especially to move beyond tokenism. This whole,
Mm-hmm.
well, we have a gay person on our staff, or
Mm-hmm.
we hired that one Black person as a diversity hire. So see, we're different, but you're
Yeah.
not listening. You're
Yeah.
not taking what these individuals have to offer in a perspective. You're not listening to their valid criticisms, perhaps, of what you're
Yeah.
doing within the company to make it more truly inclusive,
Yeah.
as opposed to just showing that you are, or trying to show that
But
you are.
you're also not incorporating it as a personal value. Tammy and
Yes.
Susan, I actually
Hmm.
have this presentation that we do around a queer community and serving a queer community. And there's a section there about how can you create change in your personal life and in your
Hmm.
community, right? This idea that, there was some research, I think it was like 2016, that said something like 3/4 of white Americans don't socialize outside of their racial group.
Hmm.
Right. And so even if you put a brown person on that staff, even if you have like the queer Black token person who's there to
Hmm.
disrupt all of the homophobic, racist stuff that happens, which by the way is exhausting, and I don't get
Yes.
paid any more to do it, but I
Right.
have to do it in order to survive with some
Good
dignity
point. Hmm.
at work, but it doesn't matter because my direct report, my colleagues who are being, like super kind of managed by me to keep them out of these big cesspools of racism and homophobia, it doesn't extend to their life. It doesn't extend to their
Yeah.
communities. They're not socializing differently. They're not asking questions. They're not, they're no more present in those spaces. And so creating that
Right.
at work is a half effort, I think, when we
Hmm.
think about what actually cultivates real change, and kind of works to manage the kind of segregation that we have,
Hmm.
socially and religiously, and in all of our not work activities where someone's going to force
Hmm.
us to take the diversity training. You know what I mean? And so I think
Right.
that's a part of it too, is that, you know, these CEOs can send out the statements, but I don't know that they're shifting, the reality of the neighborhoods they live in, or the schools that they take their children to, or
Yeah.
the religious organizations that they support
Yeah.
financially. And so I think it's difficult.
And something else you said that struck me is, yeah, are we painting the house a different color, or are
Yeah.
we tearing it down because it was never built with equal access?
Right.
And how do we rebuild the houses, rebuild the systems? And I know I've had to look at what I can find scary about that, as somebody
Mm-hmm.
who recognizes I've benefited from privilege.
Yeah.
But to realize that, yeah, I'm increasingly more okay with that. But
Mm-hmm.
to know, like, how are you going to sell that on people
Right. Yeah.
who benefit from the house the way it is?
Well, and this is the thing, the folks that are, I find the people who are like, why does it always have to be about race, or why does it always have to be about sexual orientation or difference? And I think again, this is this thing where we've now made kind of white discomfort more important than
Yeah,
equality, more important than access, right? Which
for
which
sure.
simultaneously, right, centers that pain, but also continues to erase the pain of all the folks who are not included, where it's like, hey, listen, I get it. This is uncomfortable, but it's not as uncomfortable as a fear that you would die just for existing or walking down your street. It's not as uncomfortable as feeling insecure. I'll share that my partner and I just bought a home. And
Hmm.
one of the things that we really talk about sometimes is that there is limited protection for us from an employment standpoint. I happen to work
Hmm.
for myself some of the time, but my partner doesn't have that luxury. And so
Hmm.
when you even committing to a financial responsibility
Hmm.
like a house,
Hmm.
there is that conversation for folks that I do not think exists in the same way for other people. Right.
Yeah.
For us to have to say, okay, what's our job security like? Do we
Hmm.
work for organizations that we feel like, have some things formally in place, to kind of
Hmm.
protect us and allow us to predict our income for a
Hmm.
foreseeable amount of time. And it's that kind of stuff that's difficult, where I think people like painting the house. It makes them feel good. It makes them feel like they have a fresh thing to present. But most of us, and the us, I mean the us, right? Like the Black queer folks, or the Black folks, or the queer folks, whatever. Um, it hasn't made much difference, except that I'm now invited to be on more diversity committees, which
Yeah.
again is exhausting, and I don't get paid more for it. And so people are like, let's paint this house differently. We realize it here, Lisa, come on into this committee. And you're like, hey, now I have less time to get the same work done that you're asking my colleagues to, and so there's a way that
Right.
it's like, hey, I value that, and thank you for seeing me and including me in that space.
Hmm.
But that still then challenges, are we putting folks at a higher disadvantage are at a higher kind of emotional fatigue
Mhm.
risk.
Yeah. Point very well taken. All points incredibly well taken. So, last kind of question here, and I know this may be a very big question to wrap up with, but I think
Uh-oh.
it's a common thread that's run through all these interviews we've done, and that is the role of healing trauma in all of
Absolutely.
this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, because you're a trauma therapist, trauma
Yeah.
teacher, trauma consultant.
Yeah.
Tell me your take, so to speak, or your soapbox on how do we get people individually and collectively to heal trauma? Look at their wounds that are untended.
That's like the largest and one of the most important questions, right? This
Mhm,
idea that um, how do we prioritize that, right? And how do we
mhm,
get to a place where we can even pause long enough to reflect in that way about the compounding impact of chronic oppression? And
mhm,
um, I think that operates differently for different people. Do you know? So when I think about like myself, I'll use myself because I feel like I can speak about me without
sure.
making any assumptions about anyone else.
Mhm,
But when I think about my own reality, there is this kind of like acute danger and need
mhm,
that is not done. You know, and so this idea that we would be able to put down, some of those survival defenses and those
mhm,
survival skills, it doesn't feel real. When
mhm,
I've done work with certain folks, it doesn't necessarily feel real. There isn't enough safety and security to convince a person that, hey, I think it's okay for you to kind of lower some of those
mhm,
traumatic survival tools that you're using. And
mhm.
so in that way, I think that some of that trauma becomes difficult to process in the moment because there is real danger, there is real threat, there is a real belief, right, in my ability to survive is under threat, right?
Yes.
That it can sometimes be difficult to completely confront some of those distortions, right? And to
Mhm.
completely give my body permission to really heal around that because it's continuously re-engaged, right? That wound is
Yes.
continuously bumped into. And I think about that from the perspective, of generational trauma,
Mhm.
right? And how it doesn't matter necessarily in some ways, right? Whether or not the trauma or the traumatic things were in your individual home, right? That they were pervasive in the attempt to survive of your family over a
Right.
period of time, I think is profound. And so I think the work is important, but I think some of the what's important about the work is acknowledging that it's almost like an unfair request to make, right? That we would get our bodies to a place to heal something when we have complete certainty, right? Given
Mhm.
my lived experience, that it will be re-engaged and that
Yeah.
it will become, a wound newly. And I think I'll share a story it's a personal story, but I've shared it with a couple other people before.
Mhm.
When my dad passed away, he was living in Virginia. They're from Georgia, so a very kind of like Southern Black experience, which was always right in this shell of racism and of kind of like racism directed ability. Like, where can we go? What can we do? It's based on safety. And so my dad passed away, and he was in Virginia, and my sister and I were there. We had traveled to be with him and with his mother, and we get a call from the facility where he died, and I wasn't on the call, but my grandmother's on the call, and she gets off the phone and she says, "Hey, we got to go get your dad. We got to go get his body moved."
Yeah.
And in my opinion, that facility had not done the appropriate things to maintain the integrity of his body, right? They had left him in the room, they had put kind of a fan on, but they hadn't done anything to actually preserve his body, which to me,
Mm.
I was like outraged around. I was like,
Yeah.
what? Like, we have to go arrange for this? And I'll never forget that his mother said, without nothing was important. Like, it wasn't an extraordinary statement. She said, he's a Black man in the South. And
Mm.
we were all getting up and putting on our coats and just going, because there was no expectation from her that his
Mm.
body would be treated with the respect that it deserved. And so I know
Mm.
that's like an intense example, but I think about it when I think about, where is sometimes this resistance for Black folks to participate in medical environments,
Yeah.
right? Can we see where that is historically embedded, and quite frankly, where it's been reinforced over a period of time? Because my dad did not, I mean, he didn't die like in the 20s. He's just recently passed, and that this is such a truth for his mother, that there's no space for her to feel enraged or entitled to
Yeah.
something more deserving. And so when I think about, processing my own trauma around worth,
Right.
right, and around death, and that's in there,
Mhm.
and that energy that somehow I have to find a way to create a space for my own body and my own existence to hold value, because I don't perceive the world around me as holding value for it, is a really difficult space. And then of course you add, my own personal trauma within that, it starts to become a really heavy space. And so um, I guess that's a long way of saying that I think that in order to heal that trauma, we have to be inclusive of all of it. And we have to think critically when we do history taking for our clients about what are those historical narratives that are very much contributing daily and reinforcing, right, these negative messages, and that they're not necessarily irrational. I mean, I think there's a way in which they're irrational because everyone should hold value, right? And that it's only racism that takes that away. But for a person to survive in this world, right, I think we have to acknowledge that those experiences are real and that they hold value and that they really would impact, right, a person's ability to receive care, also from a queer community. This idea that, right, a person's body, just little stuff. My partners recently had some medical things, and just begging people to navigate pronouns with respect, right? Because I know it has an impact on healing. It has an impact on comfort. You're in a very vulnerable position where people are looking at your body, and just begging a medical staff to say, hey, listen, this is not that difficult. It's not that hard. In fact, just don't use any pronouns at all. Just use their name. That would be fine. This idea that it's trying to like coach people through interacting in a way that would allow my partner to process their medical crisis without the additional burden of that language as reinforcing a traumatic space and thinking that they cannot receive care because of who they are, right? That they can't receive safe, respectful, kind of like respect-driven care. And so I think that there's there's like this oppressive reality that reinforces some of those negative beliefs, and that it's a reality. And so to be careful in that space and to make sure that we're not just engaging this one truth, but that we're being more general and more broad and with intention. We're saying, hey, these things contribute to the way in which our bodies learn to survive throughout generations, and then also within the context of your real life. Because I've been in my own therapy, and I think sometimes when you go into those therapy spaces, it's almost like your real life, it like shuts off, and you're in this like bizarre little world, where you're able to talk about things outside of the context of your life. And I think that that's not fair for people. I think it's important to really incorporate, like, hey, it is different for you to survive this space. It's different for you to feel like you matter. It's different for you to feel like you're able to engage in a potential positive future. If you have more assurances that the world is not acting actively against it, and I think that that's what's difficult for folks. So that's my spiel on that. Yeah.
Well, we thank you for that spiel and all the other spiels and soapboxes you gave us. It's beautiful. So I'm very happy that Lisa, along with Tammy Moore, are hosting a EMDR therapy consultation series of groups coming up for queer LGBTQ identified EMDR therapists to have a supportive space, or to have a space for consulting cases that might be a part of where those identifiers are part of the presentation. So I will post the flyer again for that group here on the ICM page. Thanks. And your email is on there, yes, if people want to be in touch with you.
I hope so.
Okay.
I hope we did the flyer with enough. I'm pretty sure that it is. Yeah.
That people can find you.
Yeah,
based on
I feel
the flyer.
good about it. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, we're doing that. We hope that folks show up. It's really important to me that there's like a little thing on there that says that, disclosure of your personal identity is not requested to participate in this space. We're doing it certainly on good faith, but I just want for folks to know that it's not a space that requires personal disclosure in that way, where we don't need it. We get it.
Right. Well, I'm super excited that you're doing that. I'm super excited that you took the time to talk with me today, and I look forward to hearing a lot more from you.
All right. Thanks so much.